Michael, first question. What color was the second moon?
I'm gonna guess it was probably a lot like the first one until
Mm.
till they did shadow magic with it, but I don't know.
I'm Greg, aka Moon Man, and this is Moon Messages. I'm on the boat, and I'm joined by another theory head, and one of my favorite contemporaries at that, Mr. Michael Talks About Stuff.
Hey, good to be here, Moon Man. Excited to talk about the wall and all sorts of shenanigans.
Yeah, as am I. And I was just trying to spring something on you that actually, for a minute there, I was worried that you actually had talked about like its original color in your videos earlier this year, but maybe you hadn't. I don't know.
I hadn't specifically suggested it was any color other than normal moon color
Mm,
until the whole corruption of whatever happened when the dragons were born, seemingly
okay,
making it drinking light. Yeah,
okay. I'm gonna throw down a guess then. I'm gonna say it was red. Like think of a moon that looks
yeah,
like Mars. I mean, I don't want to hold out for a multicolor like flame swirl of orange and red, or much less orange and hot pink for the color of the second moon before it was destroyed or occluded. But you know, orange and red. But I'm gonna say red, like Mars red,
yeah.
a red moon
I
and a
could
white
see it.
moon. That's my
Well,
guess.
like it could be literally blood moon colored, like that we had last night. I don't know. Did you see the eclipse last night?
I didn't. I
I
saw the
watched.
full moon out my window. I missed the eclipse.
Yeah, I forgot there was going to be an eclipse, and I'm like, "There's no clouds. What's happening to a corner of the moon? Is that a little cloud?" I'm like, "Look." I'm like, "Wait, there's an eclipse," and I stayed up late to watch it. So yeah, we got to see that literally last night. So I could see that color, like that sort of darkish red blood moon eclipse type color normally for like the if it is indeed the fire and ice moon, that would make sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like yeah, and I'm talking about like yeah, before any eclipse or
Hmm.
any, just like basic, like if it
Yeah.
was for
No. Yeah.
billions of years just a moon hanging up there, nothing wrong with it or weird, like, and the light hits it like it hits the moon. I'm guessing
Yep.
my guess that I'm going to put down is red. A red moon and a white moon. I don't know. Um,
Works for me. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Good. I'm glad that hadn't come up in your stuff because I wanted to just get us right off the bat with some wild theorizing and speculating. Hello, everybody. You know Michael from his channel. Michael Talks About Stuff. Obviously that'll be linked in the description for, if there's somehow anyone out there who's unsubscribed. It's a big internet, so, probably a few of you. Hopefully this conversation will hip you to the need to check out Michael's stuff. And I'll put some specific links to videos that we end up talking about to the degree I'm able to figure out which ones those are in the description. And of course, I'm hoping, if anyone's tuning in because they really like Michael's videos and wanted to hear him talk about some of that, I hope you'll consider, welcome, and I hope you'll consider giving my Battle of Wind theory videos a spin.
Yeah, definitely go do that. If you're coming here from my channel, go check out Moonman stuff.
Oh, thank you. So you've seen them.
Yes, yes, I have.
um, well, thank you. That's very much appreciated. The those videos are, I like this conversation, for theory heads, which is what I keep uh, calling, like, people like, who does even know what like head means as slang anymore. Does like Gen Z use that word? Probably not. Like that's like slang from 55 years ago or something. But
I think so. I think a lot of Gen Z slang is recycling itself.
good,
If
good.
they don't, dude, start it. You can start new slang now. It's easy. The internet, just start using stuff, and people will just start using it too. It's fine.
Well, I'm using the very clunky theory head whenever I refer to people who are into thinking about either making or hearing about people's insane theories about the depths of this stuff. That is, whose interest in the works of George R. R. Martin like extends into digging deep into trying to figure out what he's got buried down there, germinating, waiting to sprout into, I don't know, a tall tree or something. Um, So if you're watching this, hopefully that's you. It's probably you. It's probably not. I'd say that all to differentiate from like probably the main way we should think of these books as being intended to be enjoyed. But nonetheless, it is a way, and it is a way
Yeah.
that you and I like to enjoy them. So anyway, thank you for coming on to talk about like your wild, weird, wonderful, and I think often pretty convincing theories about those perfidious trees and those mysterious ice demons. And in the videos that you dropped earlier this year, last year, and even like this week, I actually have some notes here about your most recent couple of videos.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to talk about. And as for me, I'm done leaving comments. I'm when I binge someone's wild theories, and I've got like miles of questions. I'm just gonna grill them like I
Yeah.
grill you. That's my plan. I'm not leaving questions in the comments to go unanswered anymore. I'm just going straight. I'm going straight. Come talk to me.
Yeah.
So that's all by way of getting into like your theories that like most interested me. So and I do have a little more preamble to that about like my feelings about them, why I wanted to talk to you. Because what struck me about your videos, some of the theories you've put out in the last year, is that some of the ones that I want to ask you about, whether the analysis was along the lines of something I'd heard before, or an idea that I was hearing from you for the first time. Um, the ones I'm thinking of in particular, often ran contrary to my own prejudices about the story, and those particular mysteries. And so I'm finding myself, either blown away by something I've never heard, or which is not how all or even most theories on A Song of Ice and Fire generally strike me the first time I hear them. Or I found myself like re-examining ideas I'd had myself, because I do have ideas about everything, strongly or not, and off maybe changing my mind, including in ways like I had previously questions I had previously thought about or had been exposed to, and gone another way, or ideas I had more or less dismissed as outside of my notions. So that's why I want to talk to you. I mean, like I said, I really like your stuff, and I've got a lot of questions.
Well, yeah, yeah. Thank you. And you said you are interested in possibly talking later on, even after we talk about the theories, more about like how you decide what theories that I actually want to talk about, like how I determine what I consider to be a good theory or not. And like I would say the thing that I did is I just kind of didn't accept the general idea of the fandom was like, well, the magic and the others and the Weirwoods, George hasn't put enough in the books yet for us to
Mm,
really figure it out. And that was
mm,
pretty much the assumed uh that was where the fan was at for a long time. And I kind of do agree until we got the end of the show. I always thought once we get to the end of the show, we will have enough to actually put together where George is going with this. And that's when I was going to have to go. So, like, I was, as the show was ending, I had read all the books, I was reading a bunch of theories and stuff, and I was never really satisfied with any of the takes on the others in the old ways and everything. But
mm-hmm,
I had my ideas, and I had parts of things that people were talking about, like the blood sacrifice to the Weirwoods was obviously important. And like there's a ton of bombs dropped in Bran's final chapter of Dance that are
mm-hmm.
all really important that the fandom had like started to chew on, but no one had come like out and figured out like, okay, how do they tie in though with what George was talking about with Weirwoods in the beginning, what we saw in the show. And the entire problem is that the show decided we don't care about the magic. We
Yeah,
have
yeah.
some bullet points of the magic. And so I had originally started making videos during season 8 because I thought, okay, well, by the end of this, I'm going to have the pieces I need to finish. I felt like I was like 60% of the way to like having a
Mm-hmm.
cohesive view of this stuff. And I'm like, by the end of season 8, I'll be able to put it together. And then they just ignored all of it other than a few bullet points. And I was like, All right. And that gave me a bit of PTSD, and I just ignored the series for like 2 years. And then I kind of started slowly getting pulled back into it. And I'm like, okay, I remember what I thought was going on roughly. I'm going to just now look at what we saw in the show. I'm going to just ignore all of the other conversation around it that I didn't really agree with anyway. I'm just going to go back to base principles, look at these books again, and just try to figure out these few unanswered questions I had. And
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't going to start, and I feel like I had the benefit of having just stopped making videos after putting out like one or two during season 8. And then I didn't have to I didn't have an audience that wanted content or anything.
Yeah.
So I just like, okay, I don't have any pressure to answer this now. I'm just going to wait until I actually think I kind of figured out what George is doing. And the big breakthrough moment for that was figuring out what I think is going on with the wall, because then the foreshadowing in so many other places makes sense and it comes together and you realize like, oh, he's talking about all of this grabbing of this magical power, very specifically, often trying to grab immortality. That's what these trees do. There are bodies down in the roots of all these powerful magical trees that are doing these weird things. And like you can see, like probably when you watch my first videos, I hadn't had it all put together yet. I was talking about this stuff. I'm like, it feels like there is this foreshadowing of these bodies in the wall, at the very least near the night fort, that are
Mm-hmm.
causing all this spookiness to go on. And
Mm-hmm.
I didn't yet view the others as literally green sea or shadow babies, but then I figured that out probably because I was looking for like, how does all this foreshadowing make sense? And then I realized, oh wait, if the others are green sea or shadow babies, suddenly that foreshadowing around all these, like the wall being somehow the source of the others and the weirwoods being the source of the others, and all of this foreshadowing makes sense. All of this weird stuff about these immortal bodies. And then you look at what Stannis is doing with his shadow baby, where he's asleep and he's sending his consciousness out to do his will while his body rests. And it's like, oh, you've got these bodies that are asleep for 1,000 years and or thousands of years, and you've got these shadows that are out there in the world. Like it comes together piece by piece, but like that's kind of how George sets up his mysteries, right? Like once you see Walder Frey in hindsight has betrayed Robb, you go back and you read the books and it's all so obvious that he was going to do that the entire time. And like there are certain places where I just feel
Or
like,
foreshadowed anyway.
yes, exactly. Yes, it's like every time, and Walder Frey is an example where it's just very obvious, but there are other ones where it's just like little foreshadowing that does make sense. And it's just like, yeah, I think I have sort of guess and checked my way to a few things that like once I saw them, you look at the rest
Yes.
of the books and it makes sense of other things. And that's what how I got kind of lucky, is I guess and checked my way into a system of what George was doing with the old ways and the trees and the others all working as a cohesive system that was close enough to I think what he's actually doing, that now I've been able to over the last year and a half go through all the books again and be like, hey, this is why he's doing that. This is why he's doing that. And
Yeah.
in ways that I think make sense and give you kind of the reaction that I think you were talking about there upon hearing the theory for the first time. And I know what you're talking about because I often have that reaction going back through the books and realizing this for the first time, and then I immediately go record what I've just found. And you can see
Mm-hmm.
that especially in some of my really early videos, where I hadn't put all of it together yet, but I was kind of pretty sure I was right. And so like at times I would literally be reading the books at like 1 a.m. and like figure something out and go record for an hour. And I took, like back then I didn't have as much of an audience, so I would just record something and just hit upload right away. Now I try to like, think through for at least a day or two, uh, and then upload and,
Hey,
edit through a time or two. But
all you know, all that and the whole wider spectrum are, I think, are all valid. In a way, like if you're doing that really like immediate thing, you're yeah, it's almost
yeah,
documenting like a process of like thinking, which
yeah.
is, I'm so interested in this stuff that like that is interesting to me. I'm interested, like
Hmm.
there's so much, and I'm interested in, yeah, I'm interested in knowing the history of the theorization, the analysis of these novels. That's probably impossible at this point. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
someone would have to sell a book basically, and then be able to hire like researchers to really put together like it's that,
Yeah.
and someday there may be, um, if civilization continues on, like at some point there will be that level of academic analysis,
Yeah.
um, of these books, and including on the theorization, and that we're just trying to, you and me, we're out here trying to get cited in those papers 100 years from now. That's what we're doing. uh,
My initial plan. So like
uh-huh.
initially, in
Yeah.
my first video, I'm like, this is gonna be a 3 or 4 part series, and like the initial vision for this series is like, I can't prove all this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. I'm gonna just say everything that I think is gonna happen, and then when Winds of Winter comes out, someone's gonna find this video, and I'll get popular in like a decade because they'll be like, wait a minute, this guy kind of got it. And then people actually started
Nice.
watching, and then I started going back through the books, as I said, with these ideas in mind, and I realized like, wait, I might be able to actually prove this if I go point by point. And so that's how it turned from this is going to be a 4 part series into like, oh no, I'm just going to go through and actually try to seriously make this case because now I think I can prove it. And so yeah, that's what I'm doing now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're making the case on a number of things pretty well, and I do want to get into this more, but like just to tease, yeah, for later in the discussion, probably in the bonus section of the discussion on Patreon, for the Moon Man patrons, the word guess that you use, that's very high in my estimation of methodology. I think guessing is important here. But
Oh yeah,
now,
yeah.
yeah,
You
yeah,
got to
go
be
on.
open to just guess and check. Like you got to consider yourself always at the drawing board, and like when you hear an idea, check it. Like does that work? Like you have a little weird idea pop into your head, follow it for a minute and just see. You'll usually you run into a problem pretty darn quickly and you can abandon it pretty quickly. It doesn't waste that much time to guess and
Yeah,
check most things. So
yeah, 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 yeah. And I mean, you could analogize that to like the scientific process of a hypothesis and testing. I would not. Um, I would say, this is a story. When you're guessing about this, you're kind of trying to write a story, and I think that's not how. I
yeah,
don't see people saying it like that a lot, because it sounds like how it sounds like the process of fan fiction, and I would say that so I should be. This is I do want to save all this stuff, but like I would say like the process that's
where
going to arrive at the
it
right answer is more like is probably more like creating fan fiction than anything scientific.
I yes, so I think that is very close to the way that I view it. In that I view it like the scientific way of guessing and checking, but the thing that you need to factor into your experiment is that this is a story written by a
Hmm.
person, and so
Yeah,
that's why I factor so much into my analysis of guessing and checking. Like, what do we know about George R. R. Martin? What do we know about what George R. R. Martin believes? What are his life experiences? What has he said, about his writing process? And I think that's where what you're suggesting is it goes hand in hand, right? I do view it like I view that as a variable in sort of the scientific method to the extent that
hmm,
you analyze it to the scientific method, right?
yeah,
Like to the extent it's like that, those are variables, but you're right that you can just say it is more like trying to put yourself in the mind of like literally the reason that I want to understand what's happening in these books is more so because I want to learn how George writes.
yeah, yeah,
I knowing what happens at the end of the books to me is secondary to the fact that I think George has written such a fascinating series of books. I want to learn how to do that, and I can't know how he's foreshadowing things until I figure out what he's foreshadowing. And so like I have to analyze his mysteries because they're so endlessly fascinating to me that in order
yeah,
to learn to write mysteries like that, I need to know what he's writing. And so that's
yeah,
the end goal. So I'm not motivated by some attempt to be right. I'm genuinely putting my stuff out to be peer reviewed because if I am wrong, I want to know why I'm wrong. And when people can point that out to the extent that they can, that's helpful. Like
yeah, yeah,
it's not about trying to be right. It's genuinely like I want to figure out what George is doing from a writer's perspective. And so that's why I do try to always view my theories through like, this is a story being written by a guy. What
Yeah.
is this
Yeah.
guy? Why did he choose these foreshadowing words for this? It could just be coincidence, but also like, this is a guy. Why would he write this way? You know, this isn't random information we're being presented. He is choosing what he world builds. He's choosing what
Yeah.
he chooses to say. So yeah, I think that's important to always remember.
Yeah. 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 It's a story ultimately. Okay. I'm going to take us to the wall. I mean, you said something earlier, like figuring out what's going on at the wall is probably a gateway to figuring out a lot of the magic, and through that, a lot of the larger stuff that's going on. You said something to that effect a moment ago. And that, yeah, that rings really true to me. I mean, that is one of the first things when I first heard about this series, anyone mentioned to me, like that was one of the things. It's one of the like central images, and weird like fantasy ideas of the book. This giant wall of ice that is even bizarre in a way to the characters.
Yeah.
It's fantastical to them. It's mythological, but it's right in front of them. You know, it's this massive, unexplainable thing that they can only explain with a sort of mytho history that no one's even really sure which parts of
Yeah.
it they believe. And yeah, so I mean, I think I think that's a strong instinct on your part that the figuring out the wall is pretty central. Now, um, you blew my mind when somewhat belatedly last year, um, I watched your video, How the Wall Was Built. I think that's the one. I just watched it the
Yeah.
other day, but I didn't. I took all
That
these
that would
notes,
be
but I didn't like say which video I was watching in these notes. So I think that's the one.
it.
And me being someone with at least a bit of a theory or an idea, a pet idea about basically everything in A Song of Ice and Fire, I had my own prejudices about the nature of the wall. Um, I had appreciated a lot of other theorists' work on the wall. One question that comes up in that video: uh, how does the wall replenish itself despite weeping and sublimating?
Hmm.
That's a question that comes up in any, as I recall, in any of Preston Jacobs' stuff on the wall. Um, that he's a theorist who is very influential on me and
Yeah.
my decision to do this on YouTube. And that question is, it's kind of mundane in a way, but like it's one of these things you have to walk past to get to the answer. However mundane the answer is, however much you decide it doesn't matter, that's not a real concern, you still have to sort of ask those questions. And so, I ask myself the question, you know, um, well, could it be that it's an evaporator plate of a humongous heat exchanger, all frosty like your deep freeze? Could there be tunnels that run underground all the way to Winterfell, where heat pulled from the air by the wall warms the Starks' winter in warms their castle in winter? You know,
Yep.
um, maybe. But
Right.
I proposed that somewhere in a
Yeah.
post
Yeah.
a long time ago. I mean, not that long ago, but early on, possibly when I was still reading a Game of Thrones for the first time. But but you had another idea, Michael. The wall is trees. The wall
Yeah.
is trees.
Just the main source of magic of the old ways and the entire North probably is the source of magic in the wall. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Like it makes so much sense. The second I heard that, I was like, yeah, well, of course it's trees.
Yeah.
But you're telling me like the heart trees
Yeah.
within the
Pump
wall
the
pump
pump the
water
fluid.
up from the ground
Yeah.
and out of their leaves, a siphon action replenishing the wall structure from within.
Yep.
Um, the wall being ice that surrounds an earlier line that has frozen around an earlier line of humongous trees, possibly weirwoods, is an idea that was kicking around at least marginally for a bit. Though I had not heard it myself until your videos. But there's a bunch of other elements in there, bunch of
Yeah.
elements that I still haven't really found. I did some looking, and I haven't found anyone, saying that the pumping action thing, the heart tree as pump to pump water up to the wall, which is so elegant and just such a beautiful, simple thing that rings very true. You know, um,
Yeah.
even if like my idea was it's all condensation, like it's all just water being drawn from the air, right? And thus free, and that could still be true of the trees, because we'll get into the
Yeah, they could
cooling
draw
action,
in that.
and it
Yeah.
just draws it in from the air. But even though, so in a way, like that was enough for me to solve the question of like how is it replenishing despite sometimes weeping and presumably sublimating? Well, it's still at other times, depending on conditions, like the deep freeze in your freezer, it's just building up frost. Well, but nonetheless, the pumping action of the trees, like sucking up water, is just so elegant and perfect, along with like it being trees that like I find that really, really elegantly convincing. And then there's the other stuff that again I don't know how much, and the way you put it together, I don't know, seems to be at least significantly original. Of course,
Yeah.
everything's probably been said somewhere at some time, if unfindable, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, all of it blew my mind.
So the point you bring up about the pumps is literally the way that I came to the conclusion.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, I was rereading the Night Fort chapter with Bran, and I was struck. I've always been struck by the line that the well is the thing that frightens Bran the most in the Rat Cook's kitchen. This is
Yeah.
like the scariest room in the scariest ghost story castle that Bran
Mm-hmm.
has heard about his entire childhood. And he's staring at the Rat Cook's ovens off to the side of the room, but he's more scared of this big well. And
Yeah.
then then I realized like the entire side of the well is wet. This is a well that's so tall that like Hodor throws a rock down it and it takes quite a while for it to finally eventually land in the water. The wall of the well should not be damp normally. Like that's weird. Like
Yeah.
that should be dry, but as they go down the whole time it's damp. And then when you get to the Black Gate, George likes to end his chapters on a significant line whenever he can. And the end of that chapter's line is when Bran goes through the Black Gate, Hodor doesn't duck enough, and Bran bumps his head, and water leaks out of the Black Gate
Yeah.
onto Bran's face and drips down his face, warm and salty as a tear.
Yeah.
So George has now drawn attention to the fact that water is leaking out of this tree for some reason. This big tree inside the wall literally has water dripping out of it if you bump into it. And it just hit me. I'm like, trees pump water. If water is leaking out of this tree, that's just leaking into the wall. That's just how the wall gets its water. And then I started looking at other things, and then you find out, oh, wait, at Bloodraven's Cave, the magically warded entrance is between two weirwood trees. The entire wall is a magical ward. It's probably just a big line of weirwood trees with all of the area in between those trees warded. And yeah, you see that at the Black Gate. And then, you have the answer, or the next question then is, okay, well, so you've got the pumps. What is the freezer unit? And then you realize like Bran feels this cold seeping up from below the floor when he's there. And you realize like that does sound a lot like when the others are around. So at the very least, if not literal other bodies, there is the same magic that seemingly is the cold magic that brings the cold when the others show up is present near whatever is this well. And so it's connected on that level, or whether there's bodies in there or not. But then you look around and you realize, oh, there are so many stories about just throwing bodies into the wall at the Night Fort specifically. The 79 Sentinels and Arson Ice Axe both take place at the Night Fort, and both of those rumors are that they're just like permanently sustained in the wall. And then you think about it from a sci-fi angle, and it's like, oh wait, so being put on ice in like a magical freezer unit is like how you sustain a body in sci-fi, basically, right? Like, so like not only do you have these bodies that could be sustained by the magical trees that they're strapped to, they're literally on ice as well. Like if you have immortal bodies somewhere, them being strapped up to weirwood trees surrounded by ice is like the ultimate preservation method, especially if they're inside a giant magically guarded structure. And yeah, so then when you put all that together with all of the talk of immortality that George is doing here, that's like the thing that's tempting Bran is he going to become an immortal tree god or not?
Mm-hmm.
The House of the Undying seems to have these sad shadows that are immortal living in this hall. He's hinting at that
Mm-hmm.
idea so much. And then you wait and wait and wait. And then all of a sudden, in A Dance with Dragons, Bran sees all these other bodies still clinging to life, even just in Bloodraven's cave. And I think eventually it all builds up to where you have to just be like, okay, there's probably something like that going on in the wall. What exactly it is, people can debate, but I think all of that is strong that
It
something's
is,
going on.
and like the elegant, kind of perfect simplicity of the wall is trees, like, because of course everything is trees, so of course the
Yeah.
wall is trees.
Yeah.
And even like my idea, it's funny, like my pet idea, I didn't take this super seriously, I just thought it was a funny idea, and could be the case, but even in that, I wasn't thinking of it like a giant wall shaped like evaporator plate, like a cold plate, but that the frost froze around, but rather a line of like tall 600-foot towers with like heat
Yeah.
sink fins or branches off it that were like metaphorically like trees, but it never it
Yeah.
never it never went to, well, they could just be trees. um
Yeah.
but I was thinking like more, you know something tall and skinny and a row of them with things coming off of them for heat as heat sinks. And so that's like elegant in itself. And then, if we're asking, like, yeah, to try and figure out like the magic and everything, start at the wall. Okay, the wall is trees, and it sounds like, yeah, the water you've got. So you had the trees, which is kind of the structure. You had the water, and so then you're looking for the cold, and there's so much cold to find in the book, right? It,
Yes. Yes. He's
it
given us
and
sources of cold. Yeah.
yeah, well, we get it in the prologue.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
then we get it from Sam, both his direct observation of the other and then from his research.
Yeah.
Um, and then I believe we get it from Tormund as well. And those all those sources of cold are at least the presence of the others. And so like
Yeah.
that makes so much sense to me, and it just seems kind of elemental to the foundations of the story, trees, the
It's just
wall, cold of the others.
yeah, it's just like as we talked about, like this is a story being set up by a guy, and he's foreshadowing stuff.
Yeah.
So you got to find stuff that he has set up in this story, and he hasn't set up like hyper technological cooling towers like you were talking about. But you know what he does have? He does have these trees, and he has given them this ability through magic to do exactly what you would need to do for exactly what you were thinking must need to be done. And so yeah, it just like you said, it is that simplicity of it's just all the stuff that George is hammering home combined in such a way that it makes sense of I think what he's actually doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that is how you get yourself to um you've got the trees, you've got the water, and so you found the cold, and it comes with the others, and so that gets you
Yeah.
in those videos last year to uh others permanently strapped or crucified to all these
Yeah.
trees to create an ice maker,
Yeah.
around
It seems
which
like
this water freezes.
yeah. That was where my head went, and I was like, that seems like very metal George R. R. Martin style. And it foreshadowed by Daenerys having a line of crucified bodies of children
Yep.
that she has to take down as she goes. So it's like if taking down this line of crucified bodies is going to be important in the end, well, there's just another foreshadowing that George was doing, and that also hit me as well as like, okay, there's foreshadowing in Daenerys' story of a line of crucified bodies, a hall of weird immortal shadows, and all of that needs to be taken down and destroyed and burned to the extent that it can be. And she's
Yeah.
coming over with these magical fires that seem capable of maybe burning the magical trees, and you suddenly realize like, yeah, there's a lot of just it all is barreling into a certain direction now that makes sense, as opposed to like, well, okay, if the others need babies for genetic code because they're at a bottleneck, what the hell's going on with Daenerys? Like, what, like there was other theories for the others, but they always led off in like directions that don't, I think, cohesively come together in such a neat way. Like, you could always be like, okay, well, maybe there is some vague pact where like Jon needs to marry another. And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe. But like, if it is about dealing with these immortal bodies in these trees, that gives us like a concrete sort of thing that's more set up, in my opinion. Um,
Yeah.
because I've always felt like it would just be so out of left field if it's like, well, Jon marries another, and that's what solves the problem, is that he can go make babies with them, and that's all they needed. They just needed to make more babies. It's like, I don't know. I
Right.
don't know.
Well, this gets us to something I really want to talk when we get into the others, and like how you finally managed to flip my thinking on it, whereas I hadn't been convinced by, very, very similar broad notions before.
Yeah, yeah. Essentially, dealing with these immortal green seer bodies as a form of solution to the others kind of feels more set up than like some sort of like marriage where they need like certain people's genetic DNA or whatever, like the
Hmm.
various theories that we had about the others kind of seemingly led to either just it's going to be another pact, or like led off into ways that I don't think tied as neatly into the foreshadowing and then the other characters' arcs that we have. Whereas now, if you look at them as dealing with these bodies that are strapped up to the trees, it makes a lot of what even Daenerys is doing off in Essos completely foreshadowing and relevant to the central theme and the problem of this whole magical system in Westeros. And even Arya, when she gets dragged off, um, the Faceless Men say all men must die. Well, I think that one of the main things that the Faceless Men are probably dedicated to knowing is how do you kill these people who are strapped up to weirwoods
Uh,
or sustained by glass candles? Because
right.
all men will die other than those, so they don't really need to, do anything. But the people that they actually need to learn to kill would be people who are green seers eventually, or people who are potentially like some of the old Valyrians might have been, strapped up to glass candles. And so, like, Arya could literally, I think, learn by the end of her time with the Faceless Men how to kill these
Mm,
immortals and then return to
mm,
Westeros. And that would also make everything she's dealing with completely tied into the main central theme of all the magic, which is these immortal bodies, by not dying, are therefore continuing to exert their control over the world and not allowing everyone who comes after them to live in a free, open way that they should, because all of them have to worship these weirwoods and feed blood into the weirwoods.
yeah.
Because if you don't blood sacrifice to the weirwoods, the bodies will die, because that's probably what sustains those bodies. So the whole religion is a setup around essentially sustaining these old gods who have made themselves gods, and that just it all works so neatly, and all the dominoes of all these different characters fall in together around it, that it fits pretty well to me. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Arya could learn to leap and stab.
Hmm. Or at the very least, learn what kind of magical stabbing weapon is required to kill an immortal who
Uh
is
huh.
chained
Uh
to a
huh.
tree magically.
No, yeah. I like that a lot. I don't know if I've heard you talk about that in particular on
I don't think I've put the
the
Arya
videos.
video into a full single video yet. I think it's just kind of been brushed up against.
But you have talked about, um eternal life as punishment, or at least misery, which does make you think, as you say, of the faceless men as well, like relieving people from their misery by death. All men must die, could be all men have a right to die,
Yeah.
in a way.
Yeah, if George seems pretty clear where his books are going on immortality. Like, I don't think people could
Yeah, it's not
debate
good.
whether it's a central magical theme or not, but they shouldn't probably debate that George is making the case that it's good in the books.
Right. Yeah.
He's showing us lots of signs of it being a bad fate.
Yeah. Now, I'm interested also in how, because I actually went back and watched your the wall videos and then some of the new ones since I watched the recent more the stuff from maybe February about the others, the long discussions about the others as shadows, as being
Yeah.
related significantly to like the specter we see kill Renly that perhaps is somehow a projection from Stannis,
Yeah.
perhaps his disembodied consciousness, you
Yeah.
know, and that those things are significantly related. And I have a lot of questions about that and sort of want to talk about like how that made me think about it, what you said. But while we're talking about the wall here, I want one thing I came away wondering was like, how has your um thinking changed, if at all, since those wall videos a year ago, or a little more than a year ago, since you've been talking about the others as shadows, or is it the same? If the because it gets to, are where is their physical body? When I see an other kill a Night's Watchman,
Yeah.
what am I seeing there? Is that a shadow and there's a physical body somewhere else? Or am I seeing a physical body? And then, so the question I have that I'm not necessarily clear on is what is strapped to the wall? If that's what it is, what's crucified to a tree in there? And has that changed, or was it what you were thinking a year ago and I've missed that?
Yeah. So no, I'd say that's probably the main part that has changed now that I've viewed the others as likely green sea or shadow
Got it.
babies. But I think it, in a way, it makes it work better because the
Yeah, I
thing
agree.
that is then inside the wall is just the bodies that we see strapped to every other weirwood tree in the roots. I mean, we've only seen the roots, I guess, of one weirwood tree, but there's a green seer strapped to it, and there's actually many of them from a long time. So in that way, no, it makes it, I think, work way better because then what could be in the wall could literally be at this point the Knights, especially at the Night Fort, right? Because the Night Fort is the place where we have the most, like, the most obvious weird amount of cold seeping up through the floor when Bran visits
Mm-hmm.
it. And it's also got all of the really creepy, weird ghost stories that seem to imply some proximity to dark magic. And it's the place where the Night's King and all his people were. So I kind of think at this point, if the Night's King, depending on who he was, he may have strapped himself up to that tree that is the Black Gate and was
Mm-hmm.
birthing others with the Night's Queen. And then when they, find these people, they defeat them. They're these immortal people who they maybe can't even kill. Like if they are strapped to the weirwoods, but their bodies are like wed to the trees in the way you could be tied to a glass candle flame, you
Mm-hmm.
might be able to stab these guys, but not even kill them unless you kill the big trees that they're tied to and that their life is tied to. Potentially, I don't know. I'm
So
obviously
when we
speculation
saw
here, but
Yeah, so when we saw Sam slay another, it's possible that he just dissipated the shadow in that
yes,
moment. It will
yes,
have to be conjured again or something.
yes,
But
yes.
from
But
yeah.
because the Night's King has now been locked in the wall, that's sort of the thing, is if you can't actually kill the body of the Night's King and his corpse queen potentially, because the corpse queen seems like the icy Melisandre, eyes like blue stars, whereas Mel's eyes are like red stars, and I think Mel is probably tied to a glass candle and therefore difficult to kill, as Maester Crescent found out. So okay, let's imagine you've got to quickly deal with these two magical people before they start banging again and making others. One thing you could, in theory, do is strap them to opposite sides of this giant weirwood tree, crucify them there so they're never being able to move and make physical contact again, and then freeze all the ice around them, trapping them there
Mhm.
forever, growing angrier and angrier at humanity because they're immortal. And basically, the Night's Queen, if she exists, or this Corpse Queen, is a 10,000-year-old Stoneheart. She was married to a Stark who
Yeah.
was defeated in battle, and she is now immortal and hellbent on revenge. And I think she views all of humanity in the way that Catelyn Stark views the phrase. So that could be the thing. If she has, and this is part of the some tinfoil level speculation potentially, but I think the Black Gate was covered up for a long time, and someone had to uncover it, because if it was uncovered in the state that it is now when the Night's Fort was last being used, I think the Night's Watch would know that it was down there. But if it was walled in
Yeah.
by bricks and someone who was connected to Weirwood magic was able to find out it was down there because they're connected to Weirwoods, aka Bloodraven, in between his disappearance and when he became a tree, I think he could
Mm-hmm.
have chipped out and chiseled out the Black Gate to use it as a way to get through the wall unknowingly. Um,
Oh.
and
And
when he
thus
did that,
released something.
released the Night's Queen, who is now out again, able to birth new others, which she may be taking Craster's sons and doing that with them now. But in any case, it is entirely possible, I think, now that Bloodraven freed one of the two, or at least one of the potentially many bodies who were helping the Night's King back then that are still strapped to that tree. I put out a video most recently that maybe Night's King, if he was a Stark, would have also been taken back to the Stark crypts. So
Yeah.
that could still lead to the climactic final battle being getting down to the crypts and killing these immortal bodies down there. And it would also give the others, especially, by the way, if the Night's King broke up with his corpse queen and she's now heartbroken and pissed off and frozen in the wall for 10,000 years,
Yeah.
she might want to get to the Stark crypts of Winterfell and kill that guy too. So, like,
Yeah.
she might want to wipe out all of humanity. And that could be why in the television show, the others had that motivation of wiping out all of humanity, even though they are potentially even the source of these, if they're sourced from humanity. It's because this figure who is birthing them all has been turned into Stoneheart, and Stoneheart, watching her, this mother figure who's married to a Stark, go through this transformation, foreshadows for us how this Night's Queen figure could have ended up in such a hateful, revenge-filled state. Then you imagine her being frozen in the wall in that state for 10,000 years, and then you release her. Of course, she wants to destroy all of humanity. Like, I think that's
Yeah.
foreshadowed pretty well.
It's also a way that, and of course, this, there's a number of ways this has been speculated, some fairly obvious, like that the Night's King could be this also the same as the Night King from the show.
Right.
In that,
well, if you remember,
so if there would be, if you're, if some parts of this are correct, and the Night King is strapped to a tree, but able possibly to project a shadow of himself, or someone is, then that would be out there as an other, and would be,
and
kind of similar potentially to the Night King from the show.
Right. And so the thing about the Night King in the show is I'm pretty sure it was not. I'm maybe I'm misremembering this. Someone in the comments can correct me or go look into this because it is kind of relevant if true. I almost think the first time we saw the Night's King, they had it in the description of the HBO episode that he was called the Night's King, and then they quickly deleted that, but people had already seen it, so then they just called him that from that point forward. But it was almost like that was a thing that they shouldn't have said, and then they realized it was too late, and so they just leaned into it. But I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that is a memory that I have of it was a big deal when we found out he was named the Night's King, and I almost think they did try to walk it back for a second, and then it wasn't walk backable, so they didn't want to draw more attention to it. But George literally said at one point, when he was asked specifically about is the Night's King in the show related to the Night's King in the books, he said the Night's King in the books was a figure from the Age of Heroes who lived 10,000 years ago. He's no more likely to be alive now than Bran the Builder or Lan the Clever. But that's such weasel words, George, because Bran the Builder isn't doing the Weirwood magic with the Children of the Forest. And when everyone sees our Bran doing Weirwood magic with the Children of the Forest, they realize, oh, on the path he's on, he's going to be an immortal king who lives forever. That's pretty creepy. So when we look at Bran the Builder doing Weirwood magic with the Children of the Forest, it's oh yeah, of course he's still alive down in the roots of the Weirwood tree somewhere, and so is the freaking Night King, George, you crafty little guy there. That's what I think is kind of going on, is the source of the others is the Night's King strapped to a tree, and the show showed us that in a form that ignores all of the details of the magic because they thought that stuff is for nerds. When you look at the show and realize they just kind of thought magic is for nerds, but they told us the story ignoring all of the Weirwood magic. You realize they kind of did do that, and it made the show suck. And it was a bad, the missing magic is what kind of made the show suck. But once you realize how the magic George has set up ties in with what the show did show us, it comes together nicely. you know.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, it definitely could have been done differently. I mean, the magic is pretty downplayed in the books, but you could this is the case with a lot of their method of adaptation is like you can also like not highlight or even leave scenes or information out, but not necessarily contradict them. And you would have a
Yeah.
more cohesive. You wouldn't be closing doors on yourself or having to then make up a bunch of shit and shortcuts to like tie it all together.
Yeah.
I think that's the case with the magic. It's already extremely downplayed in the books. That may start to change, just like it
I think that's
starts
going to
to kind
change.
of at
Yeah.
about the point we're at, at the end of the Storm of Swords, which is about the point we're at in the story. We haven't really, gotten a lot
Yeah.
farther past that. Um,
Yeah, fair
but
enough. Yeah.
but yeah, I mean that makes sense to me. So in your, I think it's your most recent video or your second to most recent video. Yeah, you actually speculate. You give a scenario. I'm sure, again, I'm sure this is something that's come up before. But that the Night King was actually Bran the Builder.
Yeah.
Um, and that that's a pretty tidy. He has an interesting. This is why another thing. Like I tend to just so a lot of this stuff. Like my theories uh, are not the ones I'm putting out there. Are not related to the magic at all. Um, they're not related to prophecy at all. They're not related to the ancient mythohistory, really. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but you know, part of it is, in my methodology, might which we might talk about, like it's not, it's not. I'm not. I look at that stuff and I might have I do have some ideas on certain things. Like I had an idea about the wall. And was it very good?
Yeah.
Probably not. But I had an idea. But a lot of this stuff I don't have an idea on, or I have very loose ideas that basically resolve to this is useless to think about for me to come up with anything new here. And I still, on some level, I do think like, well, I guess my attitude about like the ancient history is like, um, nobody clearly knows their
Mhm.
history. It's Sam and that Blackwood kid both like give us little speeches about how everything about popular history of Westeros is probably horseshit.
Yeah.
Like, and so I'm like, well, then that basically resolves to don't bother, And it's similar to I mean, I could have more to say about this, but like similar to how I think about like the prophecies and dreams, about hearing theories about this stuff, is that I'm just ultimately not convinced, not because it's impossible that they're right about certain things or that the connections make sense. It's just nothing, often it's hard for it to jump out to me because I just have this overall prejudice that like it's so deliberately convoluted and can mean so many things that like you're just unlikely to find anything. Again, like I'm not dogmatic about that, but like for me,
Mhm.
like it doesn't send me down these rabbit holes thinking about this for long periods of time. I might have a little idea and think, and then I hit a dead end pretty soon, and I'm over it on any of these things. But then you'll say something like Bran the Builder, who's talked about constantly, has no death myth, and
Yeah.
I'm like, God damn, like that is something I can grab onto because um, it does seem like yeah, there's a demise for a lot of these figures that come up in the mytho history, even the really really mythological
Yeah.
stuff, the Age of Heroes stuff. Maybe not all of them, but like it
Right.
does, yeah, it's interesting. And then there's of course there's other reason to think about immortality when it comes to Bran the Builder. But like that's just an example of
Yeah.
something from your thinking in this one of these most recent videos that I'm like, I can really grab onto that. And it really is the kind of detail and the kind of thinking that makes me actually interested in hearing your theories about the magic and the myth and ancient history and being interested and convinced.
Yeah, so I actually do tend to agree with most of what you said there about the ancient histories. Is like 99% of the time that I have a thought about the ancient histories, it leads to a dead end that this is useless or unprovable, wouldn't matter, wouldn't become relevant. And so, yeah, like I did actually like talk a long time about these books with a lot of people asking, like, what do you think? I would love to hear your thoughts on the ancient history and the timelines and stuff like that. And I had to go back and really think about it. And it's like, there's only a few places where I feel like the information is A, relevant, and B, there's enough to piece together anything cohesive. And a lot of the other ones are mostly just going to be scattered hints at like the archetypal situation, and that's what I kind
Mm-hmm.
of talked about when I talked
Yeah,
about most of these world building
that's your
things that
most
George
recent one.
does are just archetypal like references to a similar situation to show us little hints of how this could play out. But the ones that I think you can grab onto somewhat is like, okay, all of the stories we have from ancient Westeros, you take those into account, but what you really need to boil down to is we know the children of the forest exist, we know the wall exists, we know Winterfell exists, and we know that the Starks have been in charge for a long, long time and have some sort of magical connection to the old gods.
Fundamental things.
Yeah, you take all the fundamental things that it's like, okay, if this were not the case, the world we see in the story would be different. The wall
Yeah.
exists and the night fort exists. Something happened there. The Starks have ruled for a long time from Winterfell. There was a founder Stark. Like that's a fundamental thing, whether you call him Bran or not. There's a founder Stark. And so therefore it's like, okay, it makes complete sense that the founder Stark would be the last hero because whoever helps save humanity from this war with the children of the forest, which seems to be what the last hero did when you piece together like the children were at war with the first men, the children were turning trees into warriors, the others are
Mm-hmm.
probably tree-based shadows. Suddenly someone makes a deal of some sort or seeks the aid of the children of the forest, and instead of destroying everyone, now there's a pact and they're working together to keep those shadows north of the wall. And someone's building the wall in Winterfell and someone's ruling and their dynasty's in charge. It's like, okay, I'm going to just guess the guy who struck the pact is the guy who they put in charge with all of the magical power behind him because that only makes sense. It could be wrong, but if it's wrong, I don't then if that's not the case, then it's probably the case that whatever is true is not relevant or knowable, right? Because it's like
Yeah.
it's either this simple explanation or probably not something we're going to be able to figure out based on the detail we have. But when the simple explanation does make so much sense, it's like, okay, well, let's follow that logic. And then I just like, okay, so if the Bran the Builder you did sign the pact with the children of the forest, founded this whole thing, well, gosh dang, like that would be so weird if they didn't try to extend his life with Weirwood magic. And suddenly that just makes, at the very least, Bran the Builder's tales, at least, piece out, like you can piece out what might be true, right? Like, did he
Mm-hmm.
build Storm's End literally? Maybe not, but maybe he could have been like, hey, build that on a tree town rather than not. And all of a sudden you're going to have magic
Mm-hmm.
in your walls. Like Winterfell is probably built on an old Child of the Forest tree town, which, again, like what we see Blood Raven's Cave is a big hill covered in trees, and those trees form the magical ward around the hill. And at
Mm-hmm.
Winterfell, they didn't even level the hill that it was built on. Branberry specifically says that. And there's a big weirwood tree in the middle of it. So this was built on a big hill of trees that they took out all the trees that weren't magically, the center of it, but it's probably magically warded because of the underlying root network that runs to the barrier of the hill, right? Like
And then I
it
guess
fits
the
so
the crypts
well.
of Winterfell would be that town essentially. Maybe
Yes, and
maybe they
deep
bricked it
down,
up, the walls, but
yes,
or maybe it was already
yeah,
like that. But that's what those are. Then it's that town.
yeah.
That's interesting.
And right.
Um,
And right. And so it brings all of this world building into like something that makes sense of the crypts of Winterfell and the ancient history in a way that it just feels like, okay, maybe I'm wrong. But also if Bran the Builder isn't that, like we probably don't know then. So like if Bran's gonna go back and view this stuff, because that's what really got me digging in on the last hero thing, was that
right,
old Nan gets cut off from telling that story to Bran, and then
right.
Bran is told, stories wait for you, little lord. They'll be there when you come back for them, but guests are not so patient. And Bran is going to have the ability to go back into the past and view all these things. I think he's going to go back to that bedtime story right where it got cut off when the last
Yeah,
hero is seeking out the aid of the children of the forest. And that's what he's going to see. And so I asked myself, what makes sense for Bran to see that lets George wrap this shit up in a couple books? Like, we got to get to
yeah.
the end
No, yeah.
here.
You were talking about this stuff late last year. If
Yeah.
it's about the stories, if it's about him learning, um, what does he need to learn? Yeah, that makes sense. Again, like I think the whatever is going to result in being right in the end is going to involve just making good guesses that sound like a good story. Uh, those can also be wrong, but like
Yeah.
that it will also be among the right answers. If someone makes it.
And being willing to being constantly at the drawing board when presented with a better or a new piece of information, right? Like
Yeah,
you can see it through my videos going, like my ideas are evolving because I feel like I am just constantly at the drawing board. The second someone makes a good point, I'm willing to adapt to whatever good point they made. Like if someone were to suggest something that completely blows a hole in a major part of my theory, I would have to address it and regroup. I don't feel like there's any problem in that, or like I wouldn't feel any shame in that. It would be like, oh, okay, we made a new discovery, we got to figure this out now. It'd be a new problem to solve. And I think that's the attitude you got to kind of take.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Uh, another thing I really liked about the Bran the Builder as the Night's King thing, as you were trying to lay out like a plausible scenario for a timeline and a reason, and what you did was you relied on something that is could be foreshadowing of something because it's an interesting detail, which is that is our Lord Commander at the Wall, Jorah Mormont, or Gior Mormont,
Gior.
um,
Yeah.
is someone who was a lord of
Hmm.
a house and abdicated that position because he had an heir who was an adult and married and had, and was ready to take that over,
Yeah.
or whatever, or that's a possible interpretation, and that as foreshadowing, as possibly a possible practice or a sort of political familial feudal logic to like one way to um method of governance here of these
Guide.
houses and these lands is like,
Yeah.
at some point when your heir is ready, um giving them, rather than have a situation where they're waiting to inherit until you die and then are also old, and then you have just a long,
Right.
potentially a long line of old lords, all of whom have been bitter up and, and just waiting for their fathers to die for all this and all these other things. You might like abdicate and move on, and a way to do that in the North would be to go to the Wall. And uh, I like that because it takes just, something about the plot and the culture and politics, this detail of like, like Gior Mormont was the lord of his house, and he left to come to the Wall, and there is some question about that, and it's also, you know looking back, like with him in particular, we kind of learn like he almost certainly regards that as a mistake. Like it has backfired
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
his son is such a shit, which is
Right.
interesting. Like, and so that's part of the choice, which makes it this very rich thing of like, well, this is a good thing to do. It's the right thing, but like it can also go wrong. And that just makes me think that it is something. I mean, the way you put that makes me think, yeah, that some thought has been put into this and it does ring then like foreshadowing. And I like that
Yeah.
element of that.
Yeah, it might not be, but it's like, yeah, if Bran the Builder was doing Weirwood magic, he does have to have a succession plan at some point. And it's just also like the thing that I do kind of like about that when I got to the end of it so much, and like I decided I was going to make a video on it, is because it's like, yeah, it's just if you don't die the hero, Bran, you live long enough to become the villain.
Yeah.
And it is like George is a big comic book fan. It's just like it's Two-Face, like I said in the video. You turn his face over so that the people don't know their leader turned into this terrible villain. And
Yeah.
in the words of American philosophers, the whitest kids you know, it's hard to control the people if their founders were thugs. So we pretend it was all prayers, puppies, and hugs. Talking about the founding fathers of
All
America, it's
right.
just like
Yeah. Yeah.
if you if your founder was this big evil Night's King, that's going to mess with the culture going forward. That would be the exact type of thing that if you're trying to follow the old ways, you're trying to maintain the Stark's control and power and dynasty, you do not tell them that the founder Stark, using the magical power that he used to save the world, eventually turned into the Night's King. That's one of the few things that I think would actually cause them to directly wipe the dude's name from history and never speak about it to the point that it was forgotten.
Yeah.
Because you need to.
Yeah. 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 I mean, that stuff makes sense to me. Uh, okay. I want to jump to the others now. Like we've talked a little bit about like, um, your videos on them being shadows. To go back to the discussion of them in the wall and the cold, like the the idea that they are cold, um, and this issue of like the body versus the shadow. How do you conceptualize now? Then you've changed and you're thinking,
Yeah,
well, the others themselves are the shadow. They bring the cold, and
right,
maybe that's a clue to think about it. Um, but then in this case, if then their physical bodies are somehow on or
right,
have become the trees, and that is the source of the cold, um,
right.
is it that yeah,
That's
both are cold, or what?
that's the
How
one sort
else
of
would you characterize that?
right. That is sort of the one way that now it does work slightly worse for at least the way that I originally came to the conclusion
Mm-hmm.
of there are these
Yeah.
other bodies potentially in the wall is as the freezer unit. And yeah, this is, as I said, in most ways it works better. This is the one thing that has thrown a bit of a wrench into it. But the other thing that I think is kind of implied in the world building is that the Weirwoods, or at least the magic that should flow through the Weirwoods and the moons, is probably on some level or another uh like the reason that the seasons are out of balance. The
Mm-hmm.
original blurb for Game of Thrones was saying some long forgotten preternatural event has thrown the seasons out of balance. So if that
Uh-huh.
was the corruption of the Weirwoods and the moons potentially with the creation of the others and the dragons, it could just entirely be the case that the Weirwoods themselves, being the heart of winter, are the source of cold that brings the winter in the normal cycle, and potentially even like the main central one at the wall being like the thing that brings the winter when the magical cycle is working correctly, whereas maybe something over in a shy linked to the fire moon in some way or whatever brings the heat. And when both moons are orbiting in their natural cycle, you have this regular seasonal pattern of magical hot and cold and hot and cold. And in that cycle, the Weirwoods could be the source of the cold. um
The Weirwoods
so
themselves.
maybe it is the case that like the Weirwood net itself is capable of generating this cold, because like there is also seemingly a lot more snow at Winterfell than other
Yeah.
places. Like, so if
Yeah.
it's not just
As the Dance with
yeah,
Dragons ends. Yeah.
right, so like as winter is setting in, Winterfell specifically is like the center place, it seems like. So like, does winter
Yeah.
literally emanate from these specifically magically incredibly powerful world tree type trees that are used in this big Weirwood system? Maybe like that could
Mm-hmm.
explain why that sense of cold from those trees in the wall is always emanating from there. But yeah, that's sort of the direction that I would go currently. But I'm always, as I said, always at the drawing board. So if anyone has anything that makes it work a little bit better, but I do think in the end, if the seasons are going to be restored, it will be through the planting of a new world tree or Weirwood type system that works correctly and cycles the seasons correctly. And the big thing I question then is like, do we have to go to a shy and fix the fire moon? Because originally in George's plan,
Mm.
Danny was told you have to go to a shy to go forward, you must go back. And we were talking earlier about how Danny was like, all her adventures over in the East are little foreshadowings of the big central thing, right? So you got the wall of crucified bodies, you've got the House of the Undying with the immortal
Yeah.
shadows that she needs to burn, and probably linked up to magical trees as well. Um, and then if she was going to go to a Cheyenne, whatever she did in George's mind in Ashai was going to magically fix, the heart of summer, if there's such a thing. Then she comes back and they fix the heart of winter, and all of a sudden the seasons are back in order. I now wonder, like, to streamline this, when George had to realize, like, I got to wrap this up, I wonder if he originally planned for there to be like a heart of summer that Daenerys would have unknowingly fixed, in her whole, like, to go forward, you must go back, to touch the light, you must pass beneath the shadow. Fixes
Yeah.
the shadow by burning down some shenanigans and dipping out of a shy on her way to Westeros, and then burns down the heart of winter and they help plant a new one. And then all of a sudden the seasons are back in order. I wonder if that wasn't initially kind of how George viewed it going, but now I do
Interesting.
kind of question, like, I don't think Danny's got time to go to a shy. So do we have time to fix a heart of summer, or is it just going to all be the weirwood trees, or is there going to be some other explanation? That's one of the ones that I'm still, like, tumbling over in my head how that could go. But to the point, yeah, the weirwoods being a literal source of cold might just be because they're specifically very magically powerful weirwoods that are being used for ice magic. Like, maybe you can just straight up use weirwoods for ice magic, and the fact that these bodies are happen to be strapped to the weirwoods that are also being used for this ice magic, I mean, maybe isn't coincidence, but it's just a side effect, right? Like, it's not the bodies that are the source of the cold, but yeah, it's just another thing involved.
Yeah, it's the source of whatever is allowing them to project these shadows
Yeah,
is causing cold there and where
right,
the shadows go. Yeah, I mean
right, exactly.
something like that. I definitely want to talk moon stuff, but let's save that for the Patreon.
Okay.
Getting into like your I think February other videos about them being shadows, as we mentioned. Like,
Yes.
well, you say this. The on the others, you quote Martin. Strange, beautiful, think, oh, the she made of ice, something like that. A different sort of life, inhuman, elegant, dangerous. Now, that
Yeah.
is a quote I had heard before. And I I had ideas about the others, what they were, of course. And I'm reading, and I'd certainly heard ideas about, well, obviously, there's lot, especially since the show, there's lots of ideas about um the others being, and I'm sure there were always debates about like what that quote would mean, right? Like, think of the
Right.
she, like that could mean anything. That can mean just like in their
Hmm.
vibe, it can mean in their
Yes.
appearance, it can mean, metaphorically, but this is a fantasy world, so that can like that can what does that mean when
So
it's real?
the
Anything, right? um but
yeah.
I had read the prologue of Game of Thrones, and like I took certain things from it, things that I think you're probably intended to take, that made me just ultimately dismiss and not appreciate as much ideas that have certainly been around, that they are what I started to say from the show, certainly, and before, I'm sure, that they are
Yeah.
created beings more so than they are some fantasy race of beings, and
Right.
also that a possible way in which they are created is that they are shadows, that they are disembodied consciousness, something like that, analogous to the shadows we've seen. These things have been out there, but like I it wasn't how I thought of it, and I never was kind of convinced by it for similar reasons as to what we've talked about before, but more specifically because in the prologue, was the first thing I'm reading of the books, it's the way they're described. What sticks out to me, now you show there's a lot of this uh, imagery that's conjured that really foreshadows this alternate analysis, but I'm reading it and I'm like, okay, there's these humanoid guys like
Hmm.
walking around, and they've got swords and they've got armor. I mean, and when I'm reading it
Yeah.
the first time, I'm thinking, seeing, I feel like this isn't a mistake, you know, I'm seeing like the Predator armor. That's what I feel like is being
Yeah.
described here, some kind of cloaking device armor, right? It's the
Yeah.
first, time I'm reading it. And that specifically makes me think certain things that make me
Hmm.
dismiss the created being angle from the show. And that but then you drop in your videos another Martin quote that I had never heard and that
Yeah.
I found immediately extremely compelling in exactly the way you did.
Yeah.
And generally, a methodology like tangent, just an aside, like I generally am mostly ambivalent about quotes from Martin. I think similar to like even more so than the myth. I'm like, there's probably nothing you can get from this a lot of the time. Not to say should think about it and like see what is this a clue to, but he leaves so much open and says so little that
Yeah.
most of
Yeah.
the time I'm not really getting much out of it. But this is what you
Yeah.
quoted from I forget where this one was from. The first one's from an email he sent to the comic book artist. But he says
Yeah, so I found this in a post they were together, and I couldn't
right,
find
yes,
anyone like anywhere disputing that, but I also couldn't find the very specific like where George said it. So that's kind of where I was with that one. Is like I could not find the
interesting.
specific
Yeah,
place
I
where
couldn't
he sourced
either.
that quote, but also no one seemed to dispute that it was said in that initial post anywhere that I was reading it. I mean, and also the fact that I didn't know, like, is there a good way to search So Spake Martin that I don't know about? Because I did
No,
try to search it,
I tried.
and
I don't know. I don't
I
think so.
couldn't, but I can't find
Even
anything on there, so I can't.
n-
So yeah, like if someone can find that, that would be good. But like, I have been
that would
given
be
no
good.
reason to doubt that it was a quote. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I tried looking for it too, and yeah, I didn't come up with the provenance, which is interesting because it is really saying a lot. Because with just like
it is,
a couple of words, someone paraphrases,
and it,
we will learn about more
yeah,
about this about the others. He's talking about apparently their history, certainly, but I don't know about culture. I don't know if they have a culture. And
and
this
yeah,
blows me away. So if this turns out to be someone's like some bullshit, that's very interesting because my
right.
specific
And
reasoning for disregarding the show, go on.
well, I was just gonna say too. You might be able to tell when you watch that video. I had recorded the video without knowing about that quote, and I found that quote while researching to find the source of that other quote. I came across that one in the thing. I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. Like, and so I included that in the analysis, like
Mm,
sort of post in the edit. I threw that in there. So I had come to this conclusion before that, but that just hit me so hard that I did work it in. I do think this holds up without that quote though. But that
yeah,
quote
yeah,
drives it home to the point of being like, if George said that offhandedly, which this is the George quotes I think you can almost get the most from is when he's offhandedly like, oh, just like sharing his actual thought, right? Like he's just
yeah,
like
yeah,
someone was genuinely like kind of caught him off guard, like, well, I don't know if we'll learn about their culture. I'm not
Y-
sure if they have a culture. And like if he was
yeah.
preparing an answer, I don't think he would have ever said that because that gives away a lot,
It
right?
does immediately.
Yeah.
My jaw was on the ground because like exactly the reason I specifically kind of mostly dismissed ideas about them being a created race of any kind was because my initial prejudice about them reading the prologue and then thinking back to that is well they have swords and especially armor. Like okay, the swords are like made of ice that could be magically conjured, okay, but like
Yeah.
they have armor for god's sakes, which means that's
Yeah.
just seems like you're describing a culture
Right.
with uh some kind of manufacturing craft, um
Yeah.
and like and you I think rightly you describe it very well, like this sort of impossibility of Martin saying like any kind of like natural people don't have a culture,
Yeah.
right? Like that's not, you know, um,
Right.
and that's what I thought about it too. I was reading this like this seems to be signaling to me that this is a people that make things, which means which means they have a culture, which means they go back a long way, which means
Right.
they're just a race of people. And
Yeah.
that was why I was kind of stuck on that. But once you do away with that and now have to go back and rethink that stuff and realize like how I look at everything else, which is like, perception is key here. Like however they're
Yeah.
whatever's being described there, even the sword, at first, yes, of course, there can be all kinds of reasons why you would conjure a magical ice sword, even if you were a created being. And that's fine. This is fantasy.
Right.
And same with the armor thing. Like you can come up with fantastical ways, but almost more important to me, and that may be what it is. It may be that if I saw them, I would think but knew what they were, I would think, that's armor they're wearing. But it almost doesn't matter
Yeah.
if that's the case because Will thinks that. And my whole
Right.
interpretation of these books is that like perception is everything. Like it is a meditation on
Yes.
perception.
Yes.
And thus, like he's just describing his interpretation, or he's not describing it even. We are in with
Yeah.
him inhabiting his interpretation of what he sees.
Exactly.
And that's just an easy way. Again, even if they are wearing magical ice armor that is conjured on them, which is possible, it's also
Yeah.
a way for me to realize like, oh no, I can go back. I can look at this another way, which is that I don't
Yeah.
have to take any of this seriously in that regard.
It could literally be like because like when Catelyn from her perspective sees the shadow baby kill Renly, at first she doesn't recognize that it's a man. She thinks it's Renly's shadow shifting on the
Yeah.
wall. Why? Because you've never in your life seen a man made of shadow
Yeah.
blow open the doors of a room and go stab someone, but you have 1,000 times seen someone's shadow
Yeah.
shifting on the wall by firelight, you know. So that's what she sees happen. And it's not until later that she puts together what actually happened. And so like that shadow, as you said though, despite being a created form of life, it has a shadow sword. That's the thing that Catelyn notices. Is she's like, oh, the sword, Renly's
Yeah.
sword's still in his scabbard, but the shadow sword, and then Renly gets stabbed. And so like I kind of just think like if you cast a shadow of someone who is, it's weird, but like if you're just wearing armor and holding and you have a sword and you project your consciousness, does your projection have the things that you are wearing, the things that you need? I don't know exactly how it works. Like does Stannis have a sword on his hip as he sleeps that shadow then has access to, That could be the simple explanation for like why are the others wearing armor? Maybe because
Yeah.
whoever cast them was wearing armor, so they are armored in that shape made out of pure ice. And what I think is going on that really does explain the look of the others too is this consciousness projection lowering the temperature in the shape of the humanoid that it is projecting just works so well because
Mhm.
it would freeze all the moisture in the air and you would then just have this body made of ice, which is exactly what we see. And when Sam stabs it, as soon as the spell is broken by this fire magic weapon, all of the air just heats up. It just is like, it's so perfect for what you would expect to happen if all of this air in the shape of a person was magically frozen and then it just returned to normal temperature outside. It just steams away. It's like throwing a pot of boiling water into the air, right? That's exactly what I picture. It's just the temperature change rapidly when this thing is stabbed. And so that's that's how I would explain the look of them is just it's all reflective ice. And like, are they armored and having swords? Maybe, but maybe that's just because they're projected as warriors. They could
Or
be birthed
if you're
with a
looking,
purpose.
if you're seeing a body of ice, like that maybe seems more like less like a body and more like like shifting
Yeah,
sparkly
reflecting
invisible
armor.
armor, because
Yeah,
it
he's just like,
looks
well,
like something
obviously this
hard and
guy's
not
not.
yeah
Yeah, exactly. He's like,
or
obviously this
reflective
guy's
or
not just wearing almost nothing or wearing cloak or whatever, and it's
right,
reflecting and icy and hard. And so yeah,
which is
whatever
kind of
it is
like
his armor.
if you were wearing polished steel plate armor, it's like
Yeah, exactly. Whatever it is also as good as his armor, but it's not effective armor because the second it gets stabbed, we see that with Sam, like it doesn't
Yeah.
effectively work like armor, even if it is armor. So yeah,
Right. You also talk about the language, that's another piece of like where I'm like, well, of course they
yeah,
have a culture, they have a language. And
that was the one thing that kind of threw me off too.
it,
But like,
but like, yeah,
yeah,
this isn't even that. It's like, well, it can just
if
be
there's
any other
shadows that communicate,
language
yeah,
if
yeah,
they are shadows, if they are not created from scratch as some kind of monster or something, but are
right,
a
a
projection of
projection of
of
the person,
people with
yes,
a language, that makes
yep,
sense. And like and I really like your construction that it's just literally it's just the language of the children, the singers,
yeah, that could
uh
be like, yeah.
uh
Because it sounds like breaking of ice on a winter lake, which is like, even
yeah.
if it's just straight up nature sounds like as a language, like, yeah, it just could literally be some magical weirwood form of communication. But yeah. And also, if they
Yeah.
are shadows, like, there's some chance that these shadows have been existing for thousands of years somewhere locked in the north. I mean, maybe they've been birthed recently, but at least some of them could be a very, very old. So yeah, they could be speaking an old tongue. They could be speaking the children of the forest language, or they could have been in shadow form so long they needed to develop a language. But also, that does sound a little bit like a culture. But
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
could, if George did say, I don't know if they have a culture, like that, is, I don't know. Do you count that as a culture? Like, that sounds exactly like the level of having a culture that would lead to someone saying, I don't know, maybe,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, if there's shadow beings that may have existed for 1,000 years, like, I might sit there and go, would those have a culture? I guess, maybe, I
Right.
don't
Right.
know.
Would they have developed one somehow? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
No,
that's
I
why I
mean
was
that.
like,
Yeah.
George. It seems like that quote, George was caught off guard a little bit, and he's like, I don't know, you know, maybe. But yeah, like there's another quote where someone just open endedly asked George, uh, "These are books about power. I think. Do you agree?" And I like that question so much. I'm going to bring this up. I brought it up in recent videos, and I am again in a coming video because it just so open endedly lets George riff about a major theme, and where his mind goes is, yeah, power, the uses of power, how absolute power corrupts absolutely, but also the lack of power and how sometimes the lack of power can corrupt you, and the desire for power can cause people to do things that maybe they shouldn't do. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
that's such a good answer because that is thematically what's going on when these people are taking this shadow power, and like these immortal bodies, if they are trying to make themselves immortal and take this dark power, that's maybe something they shouldn't do. And that is like just a central theme of what's going wrong if my views of the others are correct. So like when you ask George, like, these books are about power, and he chooses to be like, yes, and also about how the lack of power causes you to do bad things in seeking power. It's like, yeah, that's a good open-ended question because George's writer brain just does kind of vaguely wander in a direction of like something that is thematic to, I think, the next book, especially like all of the books. But like, I think in the next book, we're going to see a lot of characters grabbing power, going fire and blood, going icy, shadowy with Melisandre at the Night Fort, like
Yeah.
doing
Hell
things
yeah.
that maybe they shouldn't do. And yeah, George just was allowed to riff for a moment, and I think those are the answers where he sort of will sometimes give away more than, his big prepared answers that he's always asked the same questions. I don't think he's gonna, like, you aren't gonna be able to ask him what's going on with this and get a good answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I mean, he's gonna obfuscate when
Yeah,
possible. Not even just for for spoiling, but because the work you want the work to speak for itself. It's sort of just a natural thing.
right, exactly.
Okay, one last question I have about the others for at least this part of the discussion, and them at the others as projections and shadows. Shadows similar, yes, to to the shadow of Stannis. Of course, there's lots of imagery you talk about of shadows. There's also lots of shadow magic referenced um, in lots of other ways, and more broadly, like that really fits into my prejudices about the magic.
Yeah.
is that it all comes down to, it's all about uh, the magic of consciousness, the power of consciousness, the power of human
Yeah,
consciousness,
life force consciousness. Yeah, yeah,
the power of human consciousness to be disembodied, to go into other things. Perhaps there's
I
perhaps
think
that's perhaps telepathy, but maybe just disembodied consciousness. Like, does
yeah,
Bran's consciousness go into the wolf, or does he just communicate with it telepathically? It seems like we're seeing, like, it could be both, but it also could
right.
be it's all just about moving consciousnesses around, and that this has all this potential power that is used in lots of different ways. I could, this is not a new idea
Yes,
of mine. Certainly, again, I come back to Preston Jacobs, thinking of developing a framework for all the magic as telepathy, telekinesis. I have maybe a few, like, a little bit different way I see a few of the details, and the way I apply them. But I mean,
yeah,
everything. It's like it all does come back to consciousness. So I like it for that reason. Okay, one of the key
yeah,
things here is the disembodied consciousnesses of beings going into the trees and perhaps
yeah,
existing in a kind of like collective consciousness. And that's
yeah,
interesting. That so it all kind of ties in there. And so maybe just to wrap us up on like the others as shadows, and the others in the trees or at the trees, like, do they have to be, you know, has this evolved? The imagery of them being crucified to the trees really makes sense. Makes sense in a lot
hmm
of ways. But I'm still like wondering, like, do you think there needs to be a body somewhere? Why aren't these, what is the
Why aren't the trees doing it
reason?
themselves?
Yeah, why or can the trees project others like this? There's all kinds of,
So
or is that not how it works? Does it have to
I think
be
I know what you're
like, there's
getting
lots
at.
of ways you could think
I
about it, but
think I
I'd
know
like to
what
hear
you're
what you
getting
think.
at. Yeah. So, in terms of why I think there has to be a human body, it's because I think George is going to have this be a story that ultimately boils down to human nature. And if there's no humans and emotional, real human level conflict, that was the kickstarting cause of all of this, that collapses. Which is what I think is so great about the idea that this is all the domino fallout of human emotions and humans striving for power and striving to not die and striving to not have
Mm-hmm.
the people they love die, that took place a long time ago and has devolved through time into this magical system that now locks everyone into this system so that those people can stay alive and hang out together as shadows somewhere. And like that's
Mm-hmm.
what you see in the House of the Undying is they're all upkeeping this big house and this grove of trees so
Yeah.
that they can have a place where these thousands of year old people can hang out together as shadows. And the reward for that is that the warlocks of Karth get to sap a little bit of magical power off of them from living in proximity to that. So I think the Starks and all these old ways lords and this whole feudal system are the upkeep of that similar system in Westeros. And I think that just works so much better than there being a godlike force that is angry, right? Like I think it has to have originated from humans, the human heart in conflict with itself, a human disagreements and all of that stuff. I think that's the way that George is going to go with this.
Yeah,
And so
that makes
it
sense to
being the
me.
trees, like I don't know how the trees would cast out a human shaped looking body without a human strapped to it. But even if they were gonna,
Let me say it a different way. What I mean is, like, why can't the
oh,
body die, that consciousness, that mind go into the tree and then be projected from the tree?
gotcha,
Like,
gotcha,
what does
gotcha.
having the
Yeah,
body still preserved in ice in the roots of the tree? Certainly, that is happening. Like, The
that
body is
it's
being
entirely
preserved.
because we see that happening. Yeah. That's the
Yeah.
reason that I suspect there are bodies there is because we straight up see that happening. And also, the other thing about magic that I was going to mention in your big tangent there is, yes, it is consciousness, but it's also, I think, genuinely, George has said everything in the real world that I think is magic is going to be magic in my books. Human life is magic. The ability to create life is magic. Sex is magic. So you have literally sex as a magical spell. George thinks music is magic. So music is magical in his world. George is a big lovable hippie who looked at the world and said, "What is magic?" And I'm going to put that in my books, and that's what magic is.
And
And
human
it's
consciousness is
evolved.
magic. Yeah.
Human consciousness is freaking magic. The fact that we are here is magic. The fact that you can have thousands of people in a big auditorium hear a song and they are all instantly on the same vibe, singing and jumping and dancing together in unison is magic. All of these things, vibrations are magic. Like George knows what magic is in the real world. He's a big hippie. He gets it. He's seen through the veil a little bit. He knows enough to write a book where the things that are magic in real life are magic in his book and make that entertaining. And I think that's his
but taken
philosophy
to an
for
extreme.
how he does magic. Yeah, taken to the most entertaining way, that in the most entertaining form that you can, take real life and put it into your story. I think that's what you should do, and I think that's what George does.
Yeah, and not even necessarily by like you could believe that these things could be there's a way in which you could believe these things could be magic for us in the way they are in the story, given the knowledge, the practice, the technique or something, like if you meditate long enough, maybe you will figure out how to do a couple of these things, on some level.
Exactly.
I find that really because like that I mean that makes so much sense to me. The things all of this is operating on being the innate structure of the world more than it is like a source of magic that is more, I don't know, something else, but rather it's just that human consciousness is very powerful. It can, perhaps somehow
our ideas
do these
create
things.
our reality on a lot of ways. Yeah.
All
right. Our perception. Literally, I didn't want to go too woo woo when you were talking about how this is meditations and perception, but our perceptions create reality, and specifically mass perceptions, like to a very large extent, what people believe becomes like the reality of the situation, at least until enough people stop freaking believing it. Like, to some extent or another.
All right, last question of before we sign off of here and we say goodbye to everybody. Thank you for watching on YouTube. For the patrons, you're going to still be listening. And of course, patrons, remember, if you ever just want to look at a fun parade of the original banners for the Moon Man Ice and Fire universe, that'll be playing on the YouTube version of this. There should be some new ones too. Okay, well, let me just say, before I ask, we'll tidy it all up here. Thank you so much for coming on, Michael.
No problem.
This is exactly the kind of discussion I want to have. Like, I could do this all day, and I'm really I have like a list of things to talk about here on the Patreon. So thank you again. Thanks for listening, everybody. Last question, Michael. What is the name of the great other? The one that cannot be spoken.
Ooh, I mean, I don't know, but the thing that pops into my mind is when you phrase it that way. Well, the Night's King his name was forbidden from history, but I don't think that that's why Melisandre thinks you can't say the great other's name. But that is the first thing that I thought of. I think it more ties into the whole just Mel is a religious fanatic, and many religions believe that saying the name of the big bad or even the big good guy is not a thing you should do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's mostly that.
But do you think
But maybe
she
his
has a
name's
particular
Brandon.
name in mind that she's not saying?
Ooh, honestly, I don't. I never considered that she does. No, I never thought about it. But maybe it's Bran.
Okay. Well, cool. Maybe I'll give my answer on the Patreon. Oh, that's too much.
All right.
That's too much. That's
Yeah.
too
Too
that's
teasing.
too much of a bait and switch. That's too much clickbait
Yeah.
because I'm not going to do that. I have a guess. I have a guess at the name of the great other.
Okay.
But I'm not going to
Do
say
you?
it on the Patreon.
Are you going to say it here, or do I just not get to know? You don't get to know.
No, nobody gets to know. It's
right.
It's too much.
You
We're
can't
not
say it.
ready. We're not ready for
You
it.
can't say it.
You can't say
Yeah,
it.
no.
You can't say it. You can't say the name of the great other.
I do know what you mean. You have to do the groundwork before you get there, or you're going to sound insane. Is it one of those?
It's that and more, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a
Stay tuned,
you know,
folks.
it's a long way. That one's a long way off.
Stay tuned. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you everybody. Thanks Michael. We'll go over to the Patreon.
Yeah, and anyone who's looking to find me, I'm obviously at Michael Talks About Stuff. I would definitely recommend, though, you go check out Moonman's videos on his whole Battle of Wind theory, and it's a really interesting perspective that I had not considered before, and I think you should definitely go check it out. So, yeah, look forward to continuing the chat.
Thank you so much, Michael. That I really appreciate that. Yes, please do. If you're interested, check out those videos. There'll be links. And yeah, off to the paywall. Thank you, man. I really appreciate it.